Weighing in with soybeans and a baby show straight out of Northern Missouri, we have Soybean Festival. From Hayward, Wisconsin, at 73 years young with the world's largest muskie statue, put it together for Muskie Fest. Finally, packing a punch with fire dancing and a pet costume contest, the Roseau, Minnesota Fall Harvest Fest. One of these festivals could win $100,000 in the Cenex Hometown Throwdown. You decide. Cast your vote at CenexHometownThrowdown.com. Cenex, powered locally.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy.
I'm political scientist Kimberly Weir, and today I'm talking with Akshat Rathi, award-winning senior reporter for Bloomberg News and host of Zero, a climate solutions podcast for Bloomberg Green. We're here to talk about his new book, Climate Capitalism, Winning the Race to Zero Emissions and Solving the Crisis of Our Age. Akshat Rathi, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here.
I really liked your book. I really liked how you highlight actual people who are involved in tackling climate change issues. And I loved the mini science lessons about the different industries. And I think it was a really nice change from the usual news about climate change, because I came away feeling hopeful, like things are actually happening and we're making some progress. And I thought it was really interesting that your background allows you to offer this unique approach that you give in your book about climate change. But I was really curious, how does a PhD in organic chemistry from Oxford find your way out of the lab, right, to become a science reporter?
Yeah, it's a windy route because I grew up in India. I studied chemical engineering for my first degree. I really enjoyed the chemistry part, not the math part, and so ended up doing a PhD in chemistry. I was on the path to become a professor. That was my goal. That's why I guess you do a PhD, at least most of the time. But the life of an academic wasn't for me. I felt like while I was doing my PhD, I was having fun, but then after that, it didn't seem very fun. So I used to write as a hobby and thought maybe I could combine my knowledge in science and do journalism. And I was lucky to find a place at The Economist, an internship to do science journalism. And I haven't looked back.
Part of the reason you end up writing this book is because of this misinformation campaign, marketing slogan about clean coal. So how did this end up leading you to write this book about climate technology?
Yeah, so I was at Quartz at the time, which is a business publication, and I was a science journalist writing about all things from chemistry to astronomy. And Donald Trump in 2016 was running for his first presidential campaign, and he was using this phrase, clean coal, which was a marketing phrase, and he even went on to describe it as you take a lump of coal, you clean it, and then you burn it, which is not possible. And so my editors were like, well, what is this thing? And turns out knowing a little bit of chemistry and chemical engineering is helpful, especially in this case, because there is a real technology where you do take coal, you burn it, and before the greenhouse gas emissions enter the atmosphere and warm the planet, you trap them, and then you bury that carbon dioxide into the earth. It is something that's been done for over 50 years, but it was explicitly not being done for climate, and now it could be done for climate. And I ended up finding a ton of people working in this field, and that's how I got started in what is the climate solutions beat. So now I define my beat as sort of climate solutions, but also false solutions, things that work and things that people claim work but don't work.
It was really interesting to read about carbon capture and storage and how this was an industry that was developed by those same fossil fuel polluters. And as you just said, that they were doing this just out of necessity to try to, right? So can you explain a little bit about how that works?
So carbon capture in its initial form was a technology being used to actually extract more oil. So the way it started is when you typically draw natural gas out of gas wells, there's often other gases mixed in it. It's not just methane. There'll be some hydrogen sulfide, there'll be some carbon dioxide, there'll be a few other gases. But of course, to the customer, you have to give natural gas. And so you have to clean it up. And in the process, you're separating out carbon dioxide often. And so that process had existed before. But what people found is that instead of simply separating the carbon dioxide and throwing it into the atmosphere, you could actually capture it, compress it, put it into an oil well, especially an oil well that is old, and enhance the amount of oil that it was producing, because the compressed carbon dioxide acts like soap and it pushes out more oil than would have otherwise come from other techniques. And it became a profitable idea to try and capture the CO2 and then get more oil out of aging oil wells. Then in the 90s, people started thinking, oh, well, this technology exists. How about we just put the CO2 into the ground in either old oil and gas wells, or there are these things called saline aquifers, which are just basically big reservoirs of saline water in the deep underground. And that way you're not emitting the gas into the atmosphere, you're actually avoiding the gas from warming the planet. And it could be a climate solution. And so in the 90s, Norway started doing that. And now there's a whole set of reasons why you would want to scale this technology up, because we are so far behind on our climate goals.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting as far as when we talk about, from an economic perspective, why this hadn't been happening all along. You mentioned if you ask an economist how to best tackle climate change, the likely answer is to put a price on carbon. So could you briefly explain what a negative externality is and how the failure to include it in market prices encourages polluting the planet?
In a way, the problem of climate change is the very start of capitalism, where you create the system where companies are able to do the work, make profits, and enrich their shareholders. But all the time, they are doing it only for things that society wants as services. That process has brought wealth, that process has brought innovation to the planet, but at the cost of pollution that has an impact, that has a cost to society, which has often not been included into the profit-making mechanism. That means these companies have been making all this money and society has been bearing the cost of the pollution that they put out for those profits. That's why economists say one way to fix this would be to price this negative externality, bring the costs of the impact into the equation to ensure that the right profits are given to these companies. And that will mean oil and gas companies would then have an incentive to not produce fossil fuels and polluting fuels, but instead produce clean energy, because if they produce polluting fuels, they'll have to pay taxes on the pollution that they're producing. That would reduce their profits. Instead, if they produce clean energy, they would make more money. But it is not as simple as that, because it is often very hard to be able to calculate what is the cost of that pollution to society. You could come up with a high number or you could come up with a low number, and you could make very reasonable case for both numbers. And so that's been the difficulty of trying to price the externality. What we have started to do is, because now we at least appreciate pollution has a cost, we have started to find ways in which either it's a direct price or there are indirect ways in which you start to price in the impacts of pollution.
And because of capitalism and how the capitalist market works, there has to be some return. That has to be about the bottom line, always, right? And so this is why in your book you talk about how the focus has always been on shareholders, as opposed to now we're starting to see a shift more towards stakeholders. And that really starts to reflect more of what's going on in the environment and our concerns about the real climate change that's actually happening. And this is certainly why, as you mentioned in your book, thus far not having put a price on carbon has been described as the greatest market failure of all time. Because we see that this is something that we have gone to just looking at the bottom line and not taking the environment into account. And this is where it gets us now. And another thing that you do, in addition to the little science lessons you give, are the mini history lesson. One is really important and essential to really understanding this book. How did we become addicted to non-renewable fossil fuels?
It is such a concentrated form of energy, right? If you look at human civilization's history over the last 100,000 years, the only form of energy used for majority of that time, vast majority of that time, was to take wood and burn it. And that is fine, but it's not the best fuel for what you want to do. And when coal and oil and gas were eventually discovered, you just found this concentrated source of energy that could be made into different forms, especially oil, for example. You can refine it into different portions and use it for different activities, that you could create new machines that were just so much more powerful, that could start to replace human effort or animal effort and produce a lot more work for the amount of effort you had to put in to find the fuel. And that's why fossil fuels took off. That's why they provided the kind of explosive economic growth that came as a result of burning fossil fuels. It became the replacement or the creation of so much more human effort that you could not have got because there were not that many humans, but you could get because of the energy in fossil fuels. Of course, we knew about 100 years ago that carbon dioxide that was being produced from these fossil fuels could actually start to heat the planet. Nobody knew how exactly, how much, but over the past 50 years, that science has become really certain. And so the energy source helped us grow economically, create these metropolises that we all live in, or at least majority of us live in the world today. But we had ignored the cost that came from burning fossil fuels. And now we're starting to bear the cost of it, and does start to include that cost in our equations.
Yeah, and I think too, another important part of this that you mentioned in your book is sort of what happens when this plays out after the Industrial Revolution. And then we see development and mass consumption and so forth. And then we see more and more people pushing for not just energy, but products like plastics that use oil. So we see this whole history starting in the 1970s with OPEC and the oil cartel crises causing oil shortages and so forth, right? And we see these booms and busts and gluts of oil. And the thing is it always resets to the status quo, that it's always back to the oil company having that, not having an incentive to actually make any real changes, as you talked about earlier with why we haven't been doing carbon capture and storage all along.
Yes, oil companies obviously make a ton of profit from their fossil fuels, and especially if that pollution is not priced. The other problem that comes with capitalism is because those profits are accumulating, and in a way, capitalism sort of has inequality baked into the system. Those with capital can then start to corrupt the system that keeps it in check, which is government and regulations. So no form of capitalism has ever operated in a free market. It has always been regulated by governments and by nature. But because the owners of capital can find ways to corrupt the system, that can mean the check on their profit-making motive is not always present as it must. And that's where there's always this push and pull between government and business. And it is a healthy push and pull to have, but at least in the last 30 years or so, it's gone the way of business far too often. And that is now starting to be reined in. That's the sort of concept of climate capitalism, that finally, because of climate impacts and because of the urgency, we are seeing all around the world in different ways how governments are finding their footing, their powers to start to rein in businesses and even reshape entire businesses to produce things that society wants today, which is often clean energy, not dirty energy.
And we've seen fits and starts where government-supported research and development has actually been there in industries like with the electric car industry. So what would you say were the main factors that set back pursuing this technology? We have the whole killing the electric car. Everybody's probably familiar with that. Like, why? Why did this happen?
Well, so let's go back again in time and start with the battery, because the heart of an electric car is a battery. And the first battery that was invented was in 1799. It was not very useful, but for cars especially, nobody thought about cars then. But the battery that proved to be very useful was created in 1860, the lead acid battery. And in the 1890s, there were in fact more electric cars on the road than there were gasoline powered automobiles. This was just the birth of the auto industry, and it wasn't clear which of these two technologies would succeed. Electric cars were, as even today, had lower range compared to a fossil fuel car, but then they were quiet and they did not have fumes being produced, and people preferred to have that. But the range of a fossil fuel car just won out. And so that's when you get the Ford Model T and you get the mass creation of gasoline powered cars. Then in the 1970s, as you mentioned, we get the oil crisis, where these Middle Eastern producers of oil, which started to form a cartel and started to play with their powers to control the price of oil, were pushing Western countries to find a way to find a different source of energy that could power cars. And so lots and lots of oil companies went out and tried to find different forms of energy, invest in different forms of energy, including nuclear. In that period, that scientific work in Exxon led to the finding of a lithium ion battery. This was a battery that was just much, much better than a lead acid battery at being able to store a lot of energy in a smaller amount of material and thus be light enough. However, the oil crisis went away, there was a glut, and because prices were too low and oil and gas companies were making tons of profit, that project was shelved and it went back into academia. Then the 1990s come along and the lithium ion battery is revived, this time for electronic devices. Sony, a Japanese company, commercializes the lithium ion battery and puts it in the Walkman and other camcorders. And that battery is again proved to be very useful. It finds itself into laptops, eventually into smartphones. And then the eventual question comes, which is, wait, we have this thing. Can we use it to make electric cars? And of course, by the 2000s, climate change and the urgency to act on climate change had grown. So you get a confluence of factors where innovation in batteries, the urgency to find a solution to fossil fuel cars, compels businesses and government to create room for the electric cars comeback, so to speak. And we see that first start off in California, because California creates what is known as the zero emissions vehicle mandate. It's just a government mandate to try and push the creation of electric cars because California wanted cleaner air and wanted to cut down greenhouse gas emissions. However, the modern era of why we have cheap electric cars is really down to China. In the 2000s, late 2000s, China put out a huge government mandate to try and build an entire industry inside China to make lithium-ion batteries and electric cars. There were a huge amount of subsidies, but there were also regulations. So if you're in Shanghai, for example, you couldn't buy a car directly. You had to enter a lottery system for your gasoline-powered car. But for an electric car, you could just turn up at a dealership and get a car you wanted. And so that approach of providing carrots in the form of subsidies to create an industry and then sticks in the form of regulations to encourage people to buy electric cars ended up creating the industry we know today, which is China being the largest maker of electric cars and batteries, largest seller of electric cars and batteries, to the extent where a lot of Chinese cars are now being exported. And China has become the world's largest exporter of cars, even more than Germany, Japan, and the US.
I can see how that with that government backing from China, that's far more possible than in the United States, where because battery range has been an issue, right? The United States infrastructure wasn't set up to deal with having battery recharging stations all over the place, which is necessary for the range that you mentioned was early on, a little less of a problem now. We were just talking about how you just did a US tour, and if you were driving from Michigan to Ohio to see the solar eclipse, that then, would that have been within your battery range at the time? And this is something that's a real concern, yeah?
Yes, in fact, it used to be a concern, but it's no longer. And we actually did that tour in a Tesla Model S.
Oh, cool.
And so It was a fully charged electric car starting in the morning, getting to a point of, afternoon where we found a charging point, put our car charged while we watched the solar eclipse, and then got back into the car and drove back. And so it's possible to do these days. Of course, range has always been an issue on electric cars, and no amount of range is ever going to satisfy people. What you really need is a good charging network, and that is now starting to be built, not just in the US, but all around the world. And so range anxiety as an issue has started to tamp down, not because electric car range has doubled or tripled, but because there's just more access to fast charging.
And I think that the kind of the key word that as you were talking about, driving the Tesla and finding a recharging station. Meanwhile, you've passed how many gas stations along the road, right? So that's the key here. And that also goes along with the infrastructure that was created at the time when gasoline petrol cars were made, right? Because it was those same companies in collaboration with the auto industry, making sure that infrastructure was in place to have gasoline station readily available, whereas the batteries got left in the dust.
Yeah, there is a tendency to think, that in the past it was industry that succeeded, and now look, in the climate era, you have to have government to make any climate solutions work. But almost always that's not true. The auto industry of the past has many thanks to give to government. So in the US, for example, it was the New Deal that led to the creation of a huge amount of roads and network that enabled people to be able to use their cars to go all those distances that you can in America. And so no auto industry, in fact, it's not just the US auto industry, but no auto industry in the world has ever succeeded without a heavy amount of government support in different forms. Japan did that through tariffs. They basically said, no, we're not going to get any foreign cars. We're going to support our domestic industry. We're going to put these huge tariffs on imported cars. And that helped Toyota become the giant that it is today. So government intervention, especially for what are seen as infrastructurally important industries, is crucial for making them happen. And we are just seeing a version of that play out in the electric car space today.
And that was possible at the time for Japan when it was developing that industry, because it was during a time in the world when the United States was giving Japan and Germany, both, who are both big car makers, a lot of leeway in terms of, because of geopolitical dynamics during the Cold War, giving them more support to rebuild their economies. So yeah, they could put tariffs on and block out imports. That's not the same sort of thing that would be possible in today's world, geopolitically speaking, I think. But it's interesting that there are some countries like China that are still well positioned to do this sort of thing. And I have to admit, until I read your book, I'd never heard of Wang Gong. He was someone who would have had to be so off the grid. Like I've never heard him. Yet Elon Musk, who would be his, US world comparison, is somebody who everybody is familiar with his name, but Wang Gong has arguably done far more to advance the electric car market than Elon Musk has.
Yes. Well, let me first be clear that trade barriers are still being used by all kinds of countries, including the US, to make the electric car industry viable. You are right that with the World Trade Organization and its creation, there should be a clear playing field between countries. And yet big economies can often get away with doing what they want on tariffs, which is what's happening to the US right now, right? It's set up all these barriers and tariffs on solar and batteries. And because it's a large economy, it can make those choices. But going to the China story, it is a fascinating story. You typically don't think about, the Communist Party having one individual making a difference. And yet that story is true. Wang Gang was this guy who was born in China. He trained as an auto engineer, studied in Germany, got a job with Audi, rose up through the ranks. And then in the year 2000, he was looking back at his home country and realizing that there's just no way Chinese could live the lives of Germans if they had to consume 16 barrels of oil per person. There's just not enough oil. And of course, with the density of population in China, that much oil would just choke cities with air pollution. And so he had a chance to meet with Chinese leadership who were coming at that time to Germany to try and figure out how can they improve their auto industry. And Wang Gang was like, nope, the better option would be to find a technology that does not use oil as a source of energy. And, he wasn't sold on batteries or on hydrogen, but he said, if you want to find a different form of energy, you might even create an industry that could become a global power. And so he's brought back the leadership, sort of gives him a chance to show whether that's possible. And he worked for about 7-8 years with industry, with academia, and in 2008 is able to show what his work led to, which was electric cars and buses at the Beijing Olympics. All the time, what he had predicted was happening. The oil import bill for China was going up, and its cities were being choked with air pollution. And so the government said, okay, now you've proven that you could do it on a small scale. How about you go and build this industry? And so in doing that, they actually looked at the California zero emissions vehicle mandate, and they modified that policy and applied it across China. So it's sort of going to the paragon of capitalism, the USA, using the policy that government was using in California, but applying it to the Chinese context, which created the industry that we know. And Wang Gang was at that time made the science minister and given the mandate to deploy this policy, which provided tons of subsidies from government, but also attracted a lot more private money coming into the system because the government had created this clear direction for where the market had to go. One of the biggest investors in that time to come and invest in electric cars in China was Warren Buffett. And he took a big stake in BYD, which is now the world's largest maker of electric cars, more than Tesla. And that's why, to me, even though Elon, has a big platform, happens to be one of the richest people in the world, you get to hear his name a lot. And of course, the social media platform helps that. But there are all these other individuals, including Wang Gang, who've made substantial contributions, and I would argue even bigger than Elon Musk, in making electric cars a reality.
Yeah, and not only has this done a lot that's really important for the Chinese domestic market, as you were saying, using the lottery to try to actually encourage people to buy electric cars over gas guzzlers, that not only just that, but this is also really well positioned China for the export market. And in fact, not only that this is something that they're reaping returns on the money that they've invested all along in the electric battery market, but they've actually left the United States and the Europeans like in the dust. So why are Europe and the United States so far behind, even though this lithium-ion battery was actually started in the United States?
So you get a combination of factors that put an industry on the back bench, so to speak. And that's when China, providing this clear direction for a market, allowed for lots more companies to invest in ideas and innovation and technologies to create a new industry. And that meant that those batteries in China are now cheaper than anywhere else in the world. Those cars in China, a lot of the electric cars in China have technologies, advanced technologies that, Western automakers would love to have in their own cars. And so that start that China got about 2 decades ago to get going on this innovation wagon has allowed it to create that extra room ahead of competition in the West. Now, with that said, it's worth recognizing that only about 2 to 3% of all cars in the world today are electric. So there's a 97% market that needs to become electric. And there's a lot of room to play. And so even though Western automakers are behind, there is just a big market to fill, and there is room for these players to catch up.
So at this point, we're at about the midway point in our interview. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation thus far. You'll find the second half on Sustainable Planet, my new podcast with Michael Baranowski. Check it out on splanetpod.com or your favorite podcast app. And thanks, Akshat, for supporting Sustainable Planet as our first guest.
Hey, it's been fun, and I hope most of the listeners will hop onto Sustainable Planet for the second half.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you're not already a supporter of the show, I hope you'll consider becoming one, because without our supporters, we wouldn't be able to do this. And when you become a supporter, you get not just that warm, fuzzy feeling knowing that you're supporting a good cause. I like to think we're a good cause, but you also get stuff like ad-free versions of everything we put out. You get our supporter exclusive midweek show, the full length of that, not just the preview. And you also get to be part of our Discord group if you want. And there's always some interesting conversations going on there. At the $10 a month level or more, you get to actually be part of the episodes Jay and I do, if that's something you're interested in. So there's a lot of stuff, is what I am saying. And I hope you'll consider checking it out. And to do that, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. If you want to support us on Venmo, we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. And all of our support links are always in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And as always, I want to close with a very special thank you to our wonderful executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,